with a studio that actually makes brands feel a little more uncommon. He is the Chief Strategy Officer at Uncommon Creative Studio, and he leads the London strategy team working with culture-driven brands like EA Sports, Jordan, and Instagram. And Uncommon was actually recently named the Fast Company's #1 most innovative company in advertising and marketing. And here is the man, Tobey Duncan.
Hey everyone. Hello. Wow, it's awesome to be here. So good to be here. I'm worried that my presentation is going to be a little bit depressing, or certainly more depressing than the Lego presentation. That's a tough act to follow. So I've been a brand strategist for 20 years, and I'm sure many people, there's probably lots of brand strategists in the room, or people whose jobs touch brand strategy quite intimately. And as I look at this moment, 2025, in many ways, I think of this as the golden era of brand strategy, right? There is so many amazing awards, there's so many amazing case studies, we have these great thinkers, whether it's Simon Sinek, whether it's Ritson, whether it's Galloway. In many ways, there's never been a better time to be a brand strategist. There's never been more intelligence and conversation around brand strategy, right? But we're also living in a time where 75% of brands could disappear and no one would care. So something is going wrong here, right? That's a piece of research that's come from Havas, and I think we should just take a minute on that. It means that 75% of what people in this room spend their lives making could disappear and people in the real world wouldn't care at all. So there's something going on, right? Why are we in this kind of precarious position? How have we ended up in a place where literally 75% of brands could disappear from the shelf and no one would care? Because think about all the stuff we're spending our days doing. We're really clear on our DBAs. You know what I mean? There's the yellow square in every ad. There is the Cadbury Gorilla. We know the DBAs. We've got the share of voice right. We've interrogated our media mix. We've kind of got the 60-40 rules playing out. We've tested the ad. We've locked the tone of voice. We've automated the content. We've done everything right, and yet no one really cares. And I think if we were really honest with ourselves, maybe we would acknowledge that. Sorry for the doom and gloom, but maybe we should acknowledge that despite all of this, the brands that we're working on can often still feel a little bit flat. So really, the era I think we're living in isn't really the golden era. It's the era where we've never done more to achieve less. And this is what I talk about with brand burnout, right? I feel like everyone in this room is probably working crazy hours, putting all the effort into their brands. And what's it all adding up to, right? Before I get to the good news, I want to talk a little bit about how I think we got here. So chapter 2. Why have we ended up in this state? Well, I think it's because we found it a lot easier to run towards the stuff that feels a little bit easier, which is the surface level of brands, right? It feels so much more relaxing when we can kind of go, God, we've defined the tone of voice. We had a great workshop around what the kind of content strategy can be. We've really busied ourselves with the surface level of brands because actually the questions that sit underneath that are much more uncomfortable. So what am I talking about here? Talking about the fact that really, if we were honest with ourselves, and maybe what some of our workshops should start with is a statement that sounds a little bit like this, which is, the world, frankly, isn't waiting for another product, another service. We don't need another water bottle. We don't need another car. And really, no one in the real world is going to love the product we're talking about as much as the people in the room. And so, how refreshing would it be if we started with this as a premise? So, my kind of point really today is that as much as we become experts in the best practice of marketing, what we really need to be focusing much more on is permission. Why the hell are we in the real world? So why are you here? Why should people care? And why on earth do you matter? Fundamentally, the world probably has enough stuff. We probably don't need another product right at this moment. We aren't in need of new things. So when we're talking about working on brands, actually the only white space now is if we start to surface a new position. So really, what I'm kind of on a mission to do is to get anyone working in the space of brands to focus a lot less on what they sell and busying themselves with articulating what exactly the product does, and start thinking a lot more about what you fix. That's a much deeper question, it's a much trickier question, but a much more powerful question. So that's the end of the bad news section. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we at Uncommon have started to kind of chart a course through this, some of the tools that we use to kind of play and create more meaningful brands. When we talk about brands that seem to make a difference, right? That difference between the brands who are 75% and the 25%, they seem to do something very, very different. They seem to find a very active role in culture, and they do that in a specific way, right? Because I think we've also all seen these brands that try and be active in culture, and then all of a sudden you're like a water bottle trying to solve world peace or something like that. And actually sometimes brands run too far into culture and it doesn't really work. So what is the playbook for getting that right? Well, I'd argue that the most powerful brands, that 25% who really do seem to matter to people, play at a very specific space. They manage to play in a space, my slides are going crazy over here. They manage to play in a space where their capabilities, the superpower of the brands, meet stuff that people in the real world need. This is a slide that we use constantly at Uncommon. It's the kind of first question we ask a brand, which is, where is the tension in the world right now that you might be able to address? And the way we look for tensions is, where are people's values out of step with their practices? Where are people kind of aspiring for things to be a certain way but being forced to live in a different place? Wherever you can find people living life out of step in that way, there's a really powerful opportunity for brands. So the three-stage playbook really sounds a little bit like this. Brand strategy, I think, can come down to three simple questions, which is, firstly, what do you do irrationally well? What are the resources of the brand? And I'm not talking about the marketing budget. I'm not talking about the kind of content. I'm not talking about the social channels. I'm talking about the core capabilities of the brand. Where are your superpowers? Where is the cultural tension that you're built to meet? Where can those resources actually make a real difference? And where is that overlap? Because that is where brands can ultimately find their fix. Because I'd love us to start thinking about brand strategy in a radically different way, not as this kind of resolution of all these to-dos and this kind of long list of marketing optimizations, but instead the fight that our brands will pick. You know, strategy really is the articulation of what fight that brand is going to fit, what fix it's going to play in the world. So I want to kind of bring three examples from Uncommon to kind of end the presentation to show exactly what that can look like. The first is FC. So any gamers in the room will probably know FC. The rest of you might know FC as previously FIFA, which is the biggest sports game in the world. They came to us and said, well, we've got a naming and a design problem. You know, we're breaking up with FIFA and we need to re-articulate what this brand can be. But actually, we didn't see the task there at all as a naming and a design question, but actually a meaning one, which is, as this game becomes an independent entity, well, what is it going to fix in the world? And when we started with that premise, we started to kind of realize that actually what football fans globally were feeling was a real frustration with the sense that the game that they had created through their fandom had been taken away from them. Whether it was because it was behind expensive paywalls online or expensive ticketing or simply just being kind of out of reach, there was a kind of sense that football was being taken away from the fans. So instead of approaching this as a naming and design job, the meaning behind it, the fix that we articulated for the brand, was to kind of restore football to the fans. And that was a far more powerful identity for the brand that's really energized it over the last 3 years since launch and created just a very different body language for the brand, not as a game, but as something that sees itself as an icon and a contributor to football fan culture. I wanted to bring this example into the room as well, which, while a UK example, is probably one that I can probably you'll be able to kind of identify with, which is B&Q is this incredibly dusty, boring hardware store in the UK. They have these giant warehouses, maybe 4 times the size of this building, and they just sell nails and tools. And when the team at B&Q came to us, they said, well, we've got an issue. 40,000 people turn up to work each day, and they don't know what they're turning up to do. And again, you know, they kind of saw the need for marketing. They asked us, well, what should be the creative vehicle that sits on top of the brand? But we saw the deeper question underneath is actually, what does this brand mean? And then for what does it fix in the world? And what we came to realize is actually, while DIY is maybe a little bit out of fashion, it feels incredibly powerful right now. Because actually, think about how much of our life is automated, right? We order on our phones, our entertainment comes to us direct into the house through Netflix. There's very few opportunities now to feel like we are the authors or the people shaping our life. So when we talk to B&Q, what we saw them fixing was something kind of far deeper. We actually saw them as helping people change their lives, actually supplying the tools that allowed us to move our lives forward. And hopefully you're starting to see in these examples how shifting the conversation and the question from, what do we, what's our advertising campaign to what do we fix, moves the brands into far more interesting places. And I think probably one of the proudest KPIs of that campaign was all of a sudden 40,000 people knew exactly what they were turning up to do each day at work. They weren't just turning up to sell hammers and screws, they were actually helping people feel more in control of their lives. And the last example I'll get to before kind of taking questions was this, SiriusXM, which if you've ever been in the United States and hired a car, you will come across. SiriusXM is a really peculiar, very uniquely American business, right? It's a satellite radio business. And satellite radio predates kind of the internet in the sense of what it allowed you to do is have seamless radio as you drove across the US. So radio stations in the US are very, very kind of territorial. And it meant that if you're driving long distances, they would break up. So SiriusXM, many decades ago, came up with this idea that we'll send a satellite to the sky and we'll have seamless radio everywhere we go. And it was an amazing product for many, many years. But of course, now in the era of Spotify and Apple Music, the challenge that they had was that actually radio was seen as a little bit backwards. Like, why would I want like a radio station telling me what to listen to when I can go onto Spotify and choose exactly what I listen to? And so again, they had this real conundrum, which simply wasn't going to be solved by asking ourselves, well, what is the advertising idea for this brand? We had to ask ourselves, well, what problem does this brand fix? And what we came to realize actually is the Spotify experience is great for casual listeners, but if you're a fan of, say, the Beatles or of Drake, and you go to Spotify, all you can get there is their catalog, and you'll probably get a playlist that serves up their classic hits. On SiriusXM, there's a Drake radio station that's co-run by Drake, and there's a Beatles station that's run by the Beatles. And what they put on the station isn't just Beatles music, but it's also the music that inspires them. It's the B-sides that you don't get to hear anywhere else. It's the things that they were listening to when they were creating certain records. So what we had was this kind of much more immersive experience. And what we started to realize when we asked ourselves, well, what does the brand fix, not simply what it sells, well, was actually this kind of need amongst fan communities to have somewhere to kind of immerse in that fandom. Because actually, a Spotify playlist isn't a great place to turn up if you're a fan, but a station that's curated by the artist, that shares all their inspiration, has clippings, and has a whole texture around it, is a far more powerful space. And so through that lens, we started to kind of see that they weren't simply selling radio, but they were fixing a problem that existed, which is that fans had very few places to congregate around their passion and really immerse themselves in it. So the idea for SiriusXM was a brand that brings fans much closer to the stuff that they love. So I started with some bad news at the beginning of this presentation. I'm going to close, hopefully, with an optimistic playbook, which really is, in my view, that brands need to stop asking how we fix our brands. I think we probably all feel quite, in many ways, that some of the brands that we're working on are kind of lethargic or in need of a re-energization. I think the wrong question is how we fix those brands. The more powerful question is what those brands fix. And behind that deeper question is the answer and the energy I think so many of us are looking for. So, thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the questions, please, on the screen? And the most popular one is by Christine, who asked about the story. Christine, where are you?
Just one.
Christina, can you jump up? Oh, over there. Can you just stay up so we can bring you the book? Oh, the book is there. Lovely. So the question goes like this. Can you share a story about a brand strategy you developed that completely failed and what you learned from it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest failure of strategy isn't when I've pitched something and it hasn't been bought. I've done that a lot. I also don't think a failure is necessarily a strategy that doesn't deliver the transformational results immediately or even in a time frame. I think the biggest failure or the sense, when I feel like, the stuff hasn't gone well, is when a strategy doesn't really click with an organization. When it simply sits in the marketing department and they're feeling kind of phenomenal about it and they're so excited about the fix that we've got to, but no one else in the business is talking about it or interested in it. I'll give you a contemporary example, which is we have just developed a new strategy for Under Armour in Europe, which has gone really, really well. And that strategy is transforming the way they design their stores, the way they talk about product. But the failure, I think, comes from the fact that we haven't truly made that a global strategy just yet. It remains very much a European strategy. And as a consequence, that just isn't, quite, like I wouldn't count that as a win. So I think any time that a strategy remains in one corner of the business and you don't have the CEO, you don't have the chief commercial officer, you don't have the architects, you don't have the product guys talking about that strategy, I'd count as a fail. And I've probably failed that a few times.
Okay, that's an honest answer. From Vika, the question, do you think that nowadays all marketing and brand image is all about creating a feeling for the customer?
Yes and no. Like I think without feeling, you're not going to get very far. But I do also think we have become preoccupied a little bit with feeling. And I don't think feeling is a strong enough navigation point. If you have the aspiration I do, which is that to put brand strategy central to the organization, not just to marketing, but to the organization, to the way it develops products, the way it talks about customers, the way it designs its stores. I think brand strategy has to deal in more than just feeling. Because when you get to certain parts of the business, a feeling isn't enough of a navigation point. I think they need a much clearer sense. And that's why I'm more interested in the question of, well, what is this brand and business trying to fix in people's lives? And remaining a little bit open on emotion. That said, there's definitely certain things that if you create and people are left feeling nothing, that you probably haven't done your job.
Egle is asking, what advice do you give for staying current, innovative, and adaptable as a brand in a highly conservative industry?
Can you say that again?
Yep. How to stay current, innovative, and adaptable as a brand in a highly conservative industry.
Is the sense that it's conservative industry here or just in the world, or?
I think that the brand is in this industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is very conservative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think someone asked a great question before, which is how do you get a yes from senior stakeholders? And I think there's a similar question here, which is how do you do something new in a category that doesn't? Like, I think part of our success rate in selling great work is knowing what kind of people really buy our work. And there is a subset of people who are just really excited by the new, who do believe that being different is a competitive advantage, who believe that brands should have a deeper role in society and not just be a carbon copy of their competitors. I think if you can find people who see the world that way, well, then that outcome becomes much easier. If you are working with people who think that actually there are some very clear conventions of the category and you should never break them under any cost, I don't quite know how you would solve that, actually. I think you've just got to find people who share that aspiration.
Okay. And the question by
Can you give me an easy one? These are very smart questions.
We're getting more personal now. It will be very easy.
What about where's my duck suit?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Gunnar has a question, and I know that he's working in a strategy and creative agency himself.
Nice. Yes.
And what is your own company's tension and fix?
Great question. And it gets a little bit Inception-like, but look, fundamentally, we love brands. We love brands. And speaking very personally, I think brands play this really important role in society. I think politics is highly effective, but incredibly slow. Individuals can be incredibly quick, but it's very hard for them to make a difference. Brands play this really important place in creating the fabric of society, whether it's some of the more political and progressive elements of society or the entertainment. brands are just massively important. So when we see a world in which 75% of them and 75% of what we spend our lives making like could disappear, that's a crisis. That's like a problem that someone needs to solve. So we think very, very deeply about that as a problem to solve. We think very deeply about how we solve that on behalf of the brands. We think deeply about what thinking got us here and what we have to change to be able to do that. And we want a world in which there's not 75%, but there's 0%, and we're surrounded by brands that people truly, truly like.
Thank you very much, Tobey, Duncan, everybody. Thank you.